There's a moment in life when the striving quiets, not because you finally reached the top, but because you start to question, why were you climbing in the first place? Most people begin the spiritual path with a dream, to become someone, a better version of themselves, wiser, kinder, calmer, more enlightened. They believe practice is a ladder, each meditation, each mantra, a rung pulling them upward, toward some higher state of being. But this is the great misunderstanding. True practice isn't about becoming someone new. It's not about adding more, achieving more, or polishing the self into some glowing image of perfection. It's about removing what was never truly you. It's not a forward march. It's a quiet return. Look closely. Everywhere you turn, the world whispers one message: become more, be more, fix yourself, upgrade your life. We are conditioned from birth to chase success, identity, image, growth, even in spiritual circles. This hunger continues. We replace career goals with mindfulness goals. We exchange status for serenity, but the chasing remains. And in that chase, we overlook the most radical truth of all. You are not something broken that needs fixing. You are not a project. You are not a seed that will one day bloom. You are the whole forest already. Practice in its deepest sense is not self-improvement. It's self-discovery. It is the art of seeing. Not adding, not achieving, seeing clearly. Seeing what has always been quietly present beneath the noise. A stillness, a silence, a spacious awareness that doesn't need to become anything, because it already is. Buddhism doesn't ask you to become extraordinary. It invites you to become ordinary fully, to sit with your breath as it is, to feel your body without judgment, to be present with this moment without rearranging it. And what you may begin to notice is that in the stillness of not doing, a deeper knowing rises. You start to sense that there is nothing missing, nothing to chase, no state to attain. Just this breath, this presence, this quiet beingness that was here before you ever gave it a name. Imagine a sky trying to become blue. Absurd, right? The sky doesn't need to become blue. It just is. But clouds come, and we forget. Our thoughts, identities, labels, they're the clouds. They move across the sky of your awareness, but they are not the sky. Practice isn't building a better sky. It's remembering the sky was always there, unchanging, untouched. The more you strive to become someone, the farther you drift from the one place peace actually lives. Right here, not in the version of you who finally gets it all right, but in the one who gently sees that nothing was ever truly wrong. So much of our exhaustion doesn't come from life itself. It comes from our endless attempt to escape who we are, and our desperate efforts to become something we think we should be. But what if practice isn't about movement at all? What if it's about stillness, not about collecting teachings, but about dropping illusions? There is a story in Zen. A student asked the master, "What is the path to enlightenment?" The master replied, "Do you hear the stream outside the window?" "Yes," the student said. The master smiled. "That is the path. No techniques, no transformations, just hearing, just being, right now. So if you came here hoping to become someone, pause, let the striving rest, let the clouds pass. You don't need to become the light. You are the light, temporarily forgotten beneath layers of identity and effort. This path isn't about reaching a mountaintop. It's about removing the shoes you didn't know you were wearing and feeling the earth beneath your feet. It's not a chase, it's a homecoming, and in that quiet returning, something shifts. There is no need to reach forward. The truth is behind you, or better yet, beneath you, within you, before words, before names, before becoming. Just be still long enough, and you may start to remember what it means to come home. Somewhere deep inside us, there's a quiet belief we rarely say out loud. I'm not enough. Yet, not yet successful, not yet wise, not yet peaceful, not yet worthy. And so we begin the chase. We chase a version of ourselves we think we're supposed to be, stronger, calmer, smarter, more enlightened. And this image becomes the horizon. No matter how far we walk, it moves further away. This is the illusion of becoming. It's the subtle voice in your mind that says, if I meditate more, if I read more, if I fix this part of me, then I'll finally arrive. But where is this you're chasing? Who is this future self you're trying so hard to become? Look closely. That person doesn't exist. It never has. From the day we were born, the world told us we needed to become someone, a good student, a worthy child, a successful adult, a spiritual person. Layer after layer, identity piled on identity, until the silence of our original self was buried under 1,000 voices telling us who we should be. So we spend our lives running from the discomfort of being not enough, running toward an image made of smoke and mirrors. But the faster we run, the farther we get from ourselves. Here's the paradox: the more we try to become something, the more we reinforce the belief that we are not already whole. And so practice, which is meant to return us to presence, becomes just another treadmill, spinning in place, going nowhere. There's a Zen saying, chasing after enlightenment is like licking honey off a razor blade. It may seem sweet for a moment, but it cuts you every time, because the very act of chasing creates separation. The truth: you don't need to become enlightened, you just need to stop pretending you are. Consider this. A wave doesn't try to become the ocean. It is the ocean. In temporary form, you are the ocean. This momentary self, with its doubts and struggles, is just a wave passing through time. It doesn't need fixing. It needs remembering. Remembering that there's nothing to reach, nothing to attain, no higher version of you waiting at the end of the path. Only this, only now, only the self that has been patiently sitting in silence, watching as you ran in circles. The tragedy of becoming is not that we fail to arrive. It's that we never needed to go anywhere in the first place. When we let go of becoming, something beautiful happens. We begin to feel life as it is, not through the lens of what should I be, but through the simplicity of what is here now. In that shift, the tension softens, the inner critic grows quiet, the breath deepens. The world, once a battlefield of self-improvement, becomes a playground of awareness. You're not here to prove yourself. You're here to be yourself, and not the self the world told you to be, not the image, not the brand, not the story, but the living presence underneath it all. Raw, open, and astonishingly complete. Let the chase end. Let the mirage dissolve, and in the silence that follows, you may begin to sense something subtle, like a faint whisper from your deeper nature. You were never lost. You only forgot how still you really are. The illusion of becoming is powerful. It wears many faces, even the seeker's robe. But when you stop running, when you stand still long enough to feel the earth beneath your feet, the illusion begins to fade. And in its place, a quiet truth reveals itself. You are not on your way to becoming something. You are on your way back to everything you already are. It begins so innocently. You want peace, you want freedom, you want truth, and so you begin to practice. You read sacred texts, you meditate, you attend retreats. You begin to speak more gently, smile more often. And slowly, without noticing, something creeps in. A new identity begins to take shape. Subtle, refined, not loud like the old ego, but still an ego. You start to feel like someone, a spiritual someone. You've read the sutras, you've sat in silence, you know the teachings, and somewhere inside a whisper forms, I am not like them anymore. This is the trap. The most dangerous illusion on the path isn't pride in wealth or status. It's pride in holiness, in spiritual purity. in being awake while others still sleep. You may no longer chase cars or titles, but now you chase virtue. You want to be seen as mindful, conscious, awakened. You wear humility like a badge, quietly hoping someone will notice just how humble you are. And without realizing it, you've replaced one mask with another. There is a Zen koan that says, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." Harsh, maybe, but the point is clear. If even your idea of enlightenment becomes something you cling to, let it go, because the moment you become a spiritual person, you step out of presence and back into performance. Suddenly you watch how you speak, you avoid conflict, you suppress anger, sadness, rawness, not out of wisdom, but out of fear that it doesn't fit your spiritual image. And so you suffer silently, inside your carefully constructed serenity. The ego doesn't die when you enter the path. It evolves. It hides behind mantras. It quotes Rumi and the Buddha. It dresses in mala beads and flowing clothes. And it becomes very, very good at pretending to be nobody, while secretly wanting to be seen as somebody special. But here's the hard truth. The spiritual ego is still the ego. It's just sneakier. And until you see it, you'll continue to seek validation in subtler ways, waiting for someone to notice your depth, to admire your insight, to recognize your vibration. But enlightenment isn't a costume. It's not a role you play. It's not how you look, how you speak, or how many hours you meditate. It's not in what others see, but in what you're willing to let go of. When no one is watching, you don't need to be a spiritual somebody. You don't need to protect an image. You don't need to appear enlightened. You only need to be real, raw, present. Sometimes you'll be peaceful, sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll radiate light. Other times you'll wrestle with your own shadows. Let that be okay. Let it all be part of the practice. Not of becoming perfect, but of becoming nothing at all. Because the more spiritual you think you are, the more separation you create. True spirituality dissolves the identity, not reinforces it. It returns you to the place where you don't need to be someone. You simply are. A monk once said, "I spent years trying to become enlightened. Then I spent years trying to hide it. And finally, he gave up both." There's a freedom in not being seen as anything. There's peace in not performing, not explaining, not proving, just silence, just presence, just this breath, with no one to own it. So if you feel yourself becoming someone on this path, pause, smile, and remember, the most awakened beings don't radiate a glow you can see. They walk softly, they speak little, they carry no identity, not even a spiritual one. Because when the need to be somebody finally dissolves, what remains is the unshakable truth of who you've always been. We hear it often, return to yourself, a phrase that sounds comforting, even poetic, but what does it actually mean? What is the self we are returning to? Is it the personality we've always had, the memories, the preferences, the voice inside our head? Or is it something deeper? So deep, in fact, that it exists before identity, before language, before the world ever told you who you were. Most people live in a house built by others, brick by brick. They inherit names, roles, beliefs, and ambitions. You become a student, a child, a citizen, a personality wrapped in stories, and after enough time, you forget who laid the first brick. You start calling the house me. You live inside it, decorate it, defend it. But you never question, was this ever really mine? Returning to yourself isn't walking back into that house. It's stepping out of it and realizing that before the walls, before the roof, before even the foundation, there was only space, and that space is your true nature. It has no story, no past, no future. It cannot be seen or grasped or labeled, only experienced in the silent pause between one thought and the next. It's what remains, when everything else falls away. And the astonishing thing is, it was never gone. You were never separate from it. You just forgot. Because the noise got loud. The return is not a journey across distance. It's the dissolving of illusion, the peeling back of every layer. That is not you. The roles, the expectations, even the idea of being a self at all. In Buddhism, this is the heart of wisdom, anatta, non-self. Not that you don't exist, but that the version of you you've been clinging to is just a passing wave. Returning to yourself means realizing you are not the wave, you are the ocean. It's not about going back to who you were at age 5. It's not about returning to innocence or to some imagined pure state. It's about resting in awareness, the unchanging, unborn, untouched stillness that has quietly witnessed every single moment you've ever lived. The awareness that watched you fall in love, that felt your heartbreak, that sat beside you in your darkest hour. Not judging, not fixing, just being. That is you. Not the surface self that wins or loses, but the silent space that holds it all. So many seekers look outward, for answers, for teachers, for signs, but the invitation is always inward, not to find something new, but to remember what was never lost. And that remembering isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes when you sit still enough to notice the breath entering your body, the pause between steps, the echo of your own presence. In a quiet room, that's the beginning, that's the return. The you that you're returning to is not a person, not a personality, not a title. It's the silent knowing. Behind your eyes, the still witness that never asks for attention, but never leaves. To return to yourself is to stop playing roles and simply sit, naked, unadorned, with whatever is. Not because it's beautiful, not because it's easy, but because it's real. And reality, when met without resistance, is the most sacred teacher of all. No one can walk this return for you. No one can hand you your own presence. But the path is simple. Be still, listen, let go, and slowly, quietly, the layers will fall, not because you forced them to, but because they were never truly yours. And what remains will not be something you become. It will be something you recognize, like coming home to a place you never left, but forgot how to feel. Before you had a name, before anyone told you who you were supposed to be, before praise and punishment shaped your posture, and comparison carved its way into your soul. There was something untouched, something wordless, something free. Your original face, not the one you see in the mirror, not the one formed by childhood photos or echoed in someone else's approval, but the face before identity, before the world entered. Zen masters speak of this original face. They ask, what is your face before your parents were born? The question isn't meant to be answered with words. It's a doorway, a crack in the wall you've mistaken for yourself. You see, the world didn't ask who you were. It told you. It gave you a role, a personality, a set of expectations to wear like clothes you never chose. You were a blank canvas, and the world began to paint. But the canvas is still there, under every layer, still whole, still silent, still yours. Remember the way children look at the world. Eyes wide, heart open, utterly present, not performing, not becoming, just being. There's no pretense in a child's gaze, no calculation, no need to prove or defend. That innocence isn't weakness, it's purity. The raw presence of life before it's edited, and you had that. You were that, not in some distant past, but always, even now, beneath the layers of who you think you are. That same gaze still lives in you, still watches, still waits. The tragedy is that we forget. We learn to smile a certain way. We speak to be accepted. We carry opinions like armor. We become characters in someone else's story and call it a life. But deep down, Something aches, not for success, not for recognition, but for realness, for that untouched part of us that knows the breeze on our face matters more than 1,000 achievements, that knows sitting in silence can be more healing than winning any argument, that knows love without needing to deserve it. So how do you find your original face? You don't. You remember. You stop becoming long enough to simply be. You stop defending, comparing, controlling. And what remains is not something new. It's something ancient, something true. You were never meant to be a product. You were never meant to be a brand, a role, a mask. You were meant to breathe, to feel, to exist, not as someone, but as life itself, in its most honest form. In Zen, there's a saying, sitting quietly doing nothing. Spring comes and the grass grows by itself. This is your original face. It doesn't strive. It doesn't try. It simply is. It doesn't care if it's beautiful or wise. It doesn't care if it's seen. It doesn't care if it's labeled enlightened. Because it existed before those words, and it will remain, long after they fade. Maybe the most sacred moment of your life won't be the day you succeed, but the day you finally sit in silence, let the world fall away, and meet your own gaze, free from all expectation, to sit with yourself, as you are, not as you should be. That is holy, not dramatic, not extraordinary, but profoundly real. A moment where the mirror clears, and you no longer see the image the world shaped, but the vast, open, luminous space that was always there, your original face. And in that quiet presence, you begin to see. You never had to return anywhere. You simply had to remove the veil, not to become, but to see, not to chase, but to rest, not to improve, but to remember, because the one you were searching for was never far, just quiet, just waiting, just you. There is a subtle trick the mind plays, one so convincing it fools even the sincere, the belief that enlightenment is something to be gained, like a trophy, like a summit to be reached, like a final stamp that says, you've made it. But who is it that wants to be enlightened? Is it not the same self that once wanted success, approval, power, love, only now it wears new clothes, a spiritual robe, a gentler language, a posture of humility, yet underneath, still grasps, still chases, still seeks. It is the seeker. The seeker is clever. It pretends to search for truth, but it's addicted to the search itself, because in seeking, it stays alive. In seeking, it maintains the illusion that something is missing, and that it will be the one to find it. So you sit, you meditate, you read, you attend retreats, and part of it is pure, a real yearning for depth, but another part whispers, if I do this right, I will transcend, I will be awakened, I will finally arrive. But here is the paradox. The seeker can never find what it's looking for, because what it seeks is freedom from itself, and it's not willing to let itself go. In Zen, they say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. It sounds violent, but it's not about harming the Buddha. It's about seeing through the image you've created, even if it looks holy, even if it sounds wise, even if it feels peaceful, because any idea of enlightenment you cling to is already a step away from truth. The true awakening isn't a dramatic moment. It's not a spiritual high. It's not the grand finale of your practice. It is the death of the one who's trying to wake up. Letting go of the seeker doesn't mean giving up practice. It means dropping the agenda, dropping the image, dropping the subtle striving to become someone even more spiritual. It's the moment you stop climbing the mountain and realize there never was a mountain, just ground beneath your feet and sky above. You were never lacking, never broken, never far. But the seeker needed the illusion of distance to justify its quest. Without the chase, it disappears. What arises in its place, stillness, not the forced kind, but the natural kind. Like a lake after the wind stops blowing. There is no more effort, no more measuring your growth, no more asking, am I there yet? There's just breath, just presence, just the simple, unspeakable wonder of being, and in that moment, you realize something profound. You were never meant to awaken as someone. You were meant to awaken from someone. The seeker dissolves, and what remains is not a better you, not an enlightened version of the ego. What remains is awareness itself, silent, unmoving, radiant, not yours, not separate, just this. So perhaps the greatest courage on the path is not to keep seeking, but to stop, to be still, to give up the chase, and trust utterly that nothing is missing, because what you are looking for is the one who is looking, and that one was never lost. If there is nothing to seek, and no one to become, then what is left, what remains? When the seeker dissolves, when the striving ends, when even the idea of progress fades into stillness, only this: you are already that. Not as a poetic metaphor, not as wishful thinking, but as a fundamental truth. So obvious, so immediate, it hides in plain sight, because the mind expects enlightenment to look like fire. But it's more like space. It wants a flash of thunder, but it's more like silence. It wants arrival. But this path teaches disappearance. You've been told all your life that you're not enough, that you must do more, be more, prove more. That salvation lies somewhere in the future. That fulfillment requires earning. But what if that entire framework was false? What if there was nothing to gain? Because nothing was ever missing. What if the sacred was not waiting for you at the end of effort, but always present in the center of stillness? This is the radical heart of the teaching, non-attainment. In Zen, they speak of no gaining mind, a mind that neither clings nor climbs, a mind not grasping for progress, because it has finally seen. There's nowhere to go, there's nothing to add, there's only this breath, this moment, this presence that was never born and will never die. What does it feel like to stop seeking? It feels like coming home, not to a place, but to a knowing so deep it doesn't need words, a knowing that whispers, you were never not whole. Even your suffering, even your doubts, even your sense of lack, all of it arose within the light. You already are. You see, the clouds don't change the sky, they only hide it, but even then, the sky remains untouched, infinite, vast, unbroken. So it is with your true nature. This is not a teaching of effort. It is a teaching of recognition, not, one day I will become awakened, but even now, I am awareness itself. It doesn't mean the personality vanishes. It means it no longer claims ownership of being. The I that wanted to attain something melts like a shadow in the light, and what's left is so simple. It almost feels like nothing, but that nothing is peace. That nothing is clarity. That nothing is who you truly are. Before the story, so now the question is no longer, how do I get there? But rather, can I stay here? Can I rest in this being without chasing the next moment? Can I trust that this is already whole, even in my confusion, whole even in my imperfections, whole even in silence, whole? You don't need to grasp the moon. You are the light that lets it shine. You don't need to climb to heaven. You are the sky that holds it all. You don't need to become anything, because you are already that. Not later, not someday, not after one more retreat, or one more breakthrough, or one more purification. Now, right here, in the most ordinary moment, as simple as a breath, as intimate as your own heartbeat. And that truth can never be taken, only recognized. In a world where everything screams for your attention, billboards, buzzwords, deadlines, and desires, What happens to the one who simply sits? What happens to the one who no longer reaches forward, but sinks inward? There, beneath the surface of striving, beneath the noise of thoughts and the weight of identity, there is something you may have forgotten, a stillness so intimate. It doesn't shout, it doesn't perform, it simply is. And it's been with you always. Before you became someone, before the labels, before the ambitions and the fears, there was just this. Presence, you felt it as a child, when you stared at the stars, without needing to name them. You touched it, in those rare moments, when time stopped, not because you were productive, but because you were present. But then the world rushed in, and it told you to move faster, to chase harder, to become louder, to turn your inner silence into outer success. And slowly, you learned to leave yourself. You learned to live on the surface of things, always scanning, always achieving, always doing. But doing is not being, and motion is not meaning. So what if you didn't have to keep up anymore? What if you could slow down, not as an act of laziness, but as an act of revolution, to pause, not because you're broken, but because you remember. Remember that there is a silent core within you, unmoved, untouched, unshaken. It doesn't belong to the personality. It's not made of your past. It's not defined by your thoughts. It's the ground of your being, the space between each breath, the still point at the center of the turning world. And the miracle is this: you don't need to create it. You only need to stop covering it up. When you sit in stillness, not forcing, not fixing, not trying to feel spiritual, just sitting, there it is, like a quiet friend, who never left, who waited patiently, beneath the drama and dreams, beneath the victories and failures. You might notice your thoughts still running. That's okay. Stillness isn't the absence of thought. It's the absence of attachment to thought. It's the awareness that hears the noise, but isn't swept away by it. It's the spaciousness that can hold both joy and sorrow, without clinging to either. It's the whisper in the storm that says you don't have to chase peace, you are peace. The world might never stop spinning, but you can. You can step off the carousel of comparison, of needing to prove, of needing to be seen, because the one who is truly still doesn't need an audience. They've remembered something deeper than praise. They've touched the wordless sanctuary within, and in that place, you're not a role, not a name, not a narrative. You are simply here, breathing, being, belonging. And from that stillness, you begin to see again. With eyes unclouded, you notice the sky, not as background, but as miracle. You listen to another, not to respond, but to receive. You walk, not to get somewhere, but to feel the earth beneath your feet. Stillness teaches you this. You don't need to escape life to find peace. You only need to return to the center that never moved. That center is the silent core within you. It has no form, no future, no fear, and it is always, always enough. The truth is rarely loud. It doesn't demand your attention. It waits. And sometimes it reveals itself not in scripture or theory, but in the quiet lives of people, ordinary on the outside, yet profoundly awake within. This is not a sermon, not a lesson. This is a glimpse, a window into the lives of those who, after years of chasing, seeking, striving, simply stopped, not out of failure, but out of realization. Let me tell you about Maya. She was once a dedicated spiritual seeker. Early mornings with mantras, a bookshelf filled with enlightenment, retreats, fasts, teachers, teachings. Her life looked like devotion, but inside she carried a subtle hunger, a belief that peace was always one more technique away. Then, one evening, after a long, silent retreat, she sat under a tree and wept, not because she had failed, but because she saw it. All this time, she whispered. "I've been trying to become something when I already am." There was no cosmic thunder, no angel chorus, only silence, and for the first time in her life, she didn't run from it. From that day forward, she still meditated, but not to fix herself. She meditated like a leaf floats in a stream, not going anywhere, just being carried. She smiled more, talked less, and lived fully. Then there's Aaron, corporate executive, mind always racing. Tried mindfulness once, said it didn't work. But after a sudden loss in his life, a brother taken too soon, something cracked. In the months that followed, he stopped trying to hack his way to peace. He began walking alone in the early morning, without headphones, without goals, just walking, just feeling the cold air in his lungs, and the silence that followed each step. He began noticing the space between his thoughts, and slowly, the space grew larger than the noise. One day, someone asked him how he was coping. He replied, not with words he'd read in a book, but from somewhere deeper. "I'm not coping, I'm not escaping, I'm here. That's all I've got, but it's enough." No retreat, no robes, just presence. That's the quiet power of return. You see, these stories aren't rare because the path is rare. They're rare because few of us trust enough to stop reaching, to stop pretending, to stop performing even for ourselves. But when we do, something ancient stirs, because what you're returning to isn't a new version of yourself. It's the original, like an old song remembered, like a mountain beneath the fog. You never lost it. You only stopped noticing. This isn't about escaping the world. It's about returning to it with new eyes, with less armor, more honesty. You don't need a new identity to wake up. You need fewer identities. You don't need to be someone great. You need to remember that even your smallness is sacred. And so, the great stories of awakening aren't tales of becoming gods. They're stories of humans who finally allowed themselves to just be, to breathe, to be flawed and whole at once, to rest in their being, without apologizing for it. Maybe your story is like Maya's, maybe like Aaron's. Maybe it's still unfolding, but wherever you are, know this: you're not far from peace. You're just a single breath away from the home. You never truly left. You don't need to seek the path. You are the path, and it begins always right here. So we arrive here, but this is not a destination. It's not the end of a journey. It's the quiet realization that there was no journey to begin with, no final place to reach, no perfected version of yourself waiting in the future, no enlightenment to chase, no self to sculpt into divinity. Just this moment, just this breath, just you, unadorned, unperformed, unstriving. For so long, we've been trained to think that we must become better, become awakened, become free. But freedom was never something to earn. It was only something to remember, like sunlight hidden behind clouds, like the silence beneath all sound. It was always there, quietly waiting for you to stop looking everywhere else. The practice was never a ladder, never a race, never a test. It was an invitation to undo, to unbecome, until only the truth remained. You were never broken, only distracted. You were never lost, only wandering, and now you're home. Not because you arrived, but because you stopped running. You stopped chasing the future version of yourself, the one with no flaws, no doubts, no confusion. You saw through the illusion that something was missing. You saw that this moment, exactly as it is, with its silence, its imperfection, its ordinary sacredness, is enough, always was, always will be. So there's no final technique, no secret mantra, no guru waiting behind the curtain. There's just you, sitting, breathing, being, and that, dear listener, is everything. If something in these words stirred something inside you, not just a thought, but a knowing, a quiet inner yes that needs no explanation, Then stay with it. Let it deepen. Let it ripple through your day, through your breath, through the smallest moments. Let your life become the practice, a practice of living from truth, from stillness, from home. If this resonated with you, if some part of you felt seen, or gently remembered what it already knew, consider joining us here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, not for more information, but for more space, more silence, more stillness, more reminders of who you truly are. Subscribe if your heart feels drawn, and may your path be soft, simple, and free until we meet again. Not in seeking, but in presence. Be well, and stay home within.